So your name is Luca,
Yes,
and you work on the second floor.
I do work on the second floor, yes.
How did that
I know
come
where you're
about?
going, yes. That wasn't intentional, that was just an accidental byproduct.
That's all I got for you, really. I've been dying to ask you that. Welcome along to your career at PaperCut so far.
Okay. Thank you.
So far.
So far. No, I like it.
Am I
get
the
it.
only one who finds this quite funny?
Well, I'm surprised you still do, because you've done a few of these interviews.
Yeah, but I keep
and that was-
stuffing it up and I keep saying on the couch. Forget about the sofa bit. I was excited to get you on today to chat about your life here at PaperCut because we've had Gemma, who's come from an IT background. We've had Willem, who comes from a consulting background.
Yeah.
And then when I met you 3 or 4 years ago, you'd come from a print background.
Yeah, every industry has got people from different, different specialties. Like at PaperCut, yeah, we've got a lot of developers, but you're not a developer, I'm not a developer. We have accountants, we have legal people, we've got the full mix. And I kind of view myself that way in the print industry. I ended up there in the early sort of years of when photocopiers were going from analog to digital and that sort of thing. And it meant that all of a sudden they needed people who were from the IT world to train their technicians of how these things connect to networks. What are networks? I mean, I actually had to start in some cases with, what's a mouse? Like, this was a big investment in people at the time to get them from those analog years into the digital years. So that's how I ended up in the print industry I thought it'd be a 3-hour cruise, but it ended up being, it's now going on 26 years of being in the print industry, but I never saw myself as a print person, if that makes sense.
What sort of person are you then?
I'm a curious person. I think that's the core of me, and it's taken me to lots of different jobs, that just so happen to have been in support of that industry, but I've been in consulting roles. Where I would be embedded in customer environments for a couple of months, mapping out their workflows, running workshops and that sort of thing, figuring out what to do so I could write some sort of business solution or something for them, write a plan for them. I've been in marketing roles, I've been in training roles, I've been in product support roles, most of my time at Canon was in pre-sales. So, going out with the solution salespeople, which they used to have, now it's pretty much the everything salesperson, going out with them as a specialist in the software to talk to customers about it. So that was my background, was software, supporting it, educating on it, that sort of thing. So moving into the print world was a part of their transition into becoming an IT service instead of just a business service, which is what they very much were before, where most of their income tended to come from things like consumables. Nowadays it's services. So yeah.
You were talking earlier when we were having a chat this morning, and it just really captured my imagination. You were talking about when you did get involved when you were starting out in your career, and you're talking about the difference between photocopiers and printers.
Yes.
Just for people watching going, what is this whole printing thing about anyway? Can you give us your little history on that period when you joined, started your career, about photocopiers transitioning into
Sure.
document sharing and printing and all-in-one printers?
Yes.
Because it sounds like it wasn't that long ago, but it sounds like it's the dark ages.
Well, I mean, if you're relatively new to working, let's just say you started work in the last 15 years, the difference between 15 years ago and 25 years ago is beyond what you could possibly imagine in the workplace. I mean, we were talking before the internet, and when I started work, I remember when email became something that each employee would get their own email address, and it was so exciting. I had no idea how bad email would turn out to be eventually. But back in those days, when multifunctional devices, multifunctional printers started to become a thing, it was an outcome of photocopiers moving from the analog world of electronics to digital. Then they had their own computers in them, they had their own memory, so they were able to do things that were just never possible with analog. With analog, if you remember, those of us who are old enough might remember this, but analog used to have lots of output trays because, for example, if you had like a 10-page, document and you wanted 10 copies of it, it would do the first page 10 times and then the second page 10 times. And they would put them into these separate output trays. Or you'd have the offline collating, which is a human, and just piles of each page, and they would go page 1, page 2,
Yeah.
But digital meant that, the photocopiers were able to deliver a better user experience. But an outcome of that was, hey, you've now got a computer, you've now got a way of driving all of the functions of this machine, stick a network card on it, and bang, you've got a network printer. So these things started turning up in corporate offices. And at the time I was working in Sydney, I was up at Circular Quay, working in a very large financial institution in desktop support. That was my role back then. And yeah, we started seeing these things pop up. And traditionally they'd been the purview of the purchasing officer, It was the facilities management people that took care of photocopiers, and printers were taken care of by the IT people, and, stick to your lane. So I remember, we had our first calls coming in where departmental level managers had used the system to buy what they decided was right for their department, and good on them for doing it, which was, we want a multifunctional device because we want to be able to print, because print is becoming a much more important part of what we do. But we still have to do things like faxing, and we still got to, and scanning started to become a thing about that time as well. So yeah, it was a fascinating change because all of a sudden the IT world were having to face all of the things that come with photocopiers. They tend to be sold differently. They tend to have different service requirements, different duty cycles, different, lots of differences. And I kind of feel like, because we're talking 25 years ago or longer now. What is it? What year is it? 2026. So we're talking almost 30 years ago. And I feel like the shockwaves of that they keep kind of bouncing back off the edges and coming back again, because there's still, IT people hate printers and they seem to hate multifunctional devices more than anything. So yeah, it's been an interesting journey.
You're a document of the history of this technology. What are some of the milestones that you recall through that period, through those years? I could talk about the introduction, I guess, of BYOD technology coming in and its impact on computers. Networking is another huge one you just touched on.
Yeah.
What are some of the big things that you've seen in your career?
The industry itself is really largely about selling finance, as we know that, and that really hasn't changed. That's been a fairly strong constant. But what has changed constantly around selling finance is the product mix and the products and services mix. And I think over time, so much of the revenue has shifted from the primary thing that they sell, being the photocopier, the MFD. They don't, the margins on those, with all the margin squeezing and just decades of tenders and training customers to reward the lowest bidder, means that the traditional service revenue that used to drive the industry shifted from what they used to call the click, which was all of the consumables and the servicing and everything that was a part of your thing. It was charged per click. It shifted from that because it became so unprofitable to the finance side of things, which meant that in many respects, a lot of these organizations needed to refactor constantly what they were delivering, and they had to become a lot leaner in doing so. So in the time I was in the industry, the OEM I worked for in Australia had over 2,500 employees when I joined in 2000, June 6th. By the time I left 4 years ago, there was sub 600 employees. But if you looked at their revenues over that time, well, chalk and cheese. So they were getting so much more out of so few people, and that of course is just representative of what all organizations are doing, which is why technologies become so important to them, because they're their ways of delivering, to those expectations of endless growth, because it's got to come from somewhere.
You said earlier about IT teams not really liking printers. Do you think printers are misunderstood?
I think printers are misunderstood by their manufacturers more than anyone else. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Any organization or individual who's creating a technology will have intended purposes in mind, as we do when we create our products, but you don't know what people are going to do with them. And I think a lot of people who are in the industry would relate to this, that a lot of the greatest innovations actually came from customers who did something different with their technology to what you expected them to do. And that then changes your value prop, because you now learn something about value you're offering that you didn't know about. And so this thing just kind of, evolves over time. And I certainly have seen, working with so many hardware manufacturers over the years, the cycles of product development are so rapid and so short. And of course that affects us with things like models being discontinued constantly and stuff like that. But they have to be constantly iterating and adding these things and trying stuff, and they'll do it in different markets. So we might see a machine here that no one else in the world sees, for example. And it might be because that manufacturer is trying to see whether this actually has a market appeal. And Australia is actually a really good market for doing that too, because we're early adopters. But yeah, it's I think a lot of the time, the requirements that customers have end up being the things that cause the iterations over time, and really anyone who's making something that's going to be used by a lot of people, you just don't know how they're going to use it.
Can you just give me, just for context, what are some examples of how customers might use a copier that wasn't expected?
Sure. I mean, not just copiers, but printers, let's just say. One of the things that was really prevalent for a big chunk of the time that I was in the industry were things like Optiforms. So Optiforms was one of the brand's title for it, but basically embedding the ability for machines to print variable data. So you would have pre-printed forms, for example, which would come out of the devices with the variable data that's been sent as a data stream from some back-end system. And it lays it all out. The system just sends this tiny little bit of information to the printer, and it goes, okay, you've asked for me to use this form that I've got loaded in my memory to lay this thing out and to structure it. Once that happened, and one manufacturer was doing it quite well, the others had to kind of scramble and figure out how to do this sort of thing. But there were a lot of design limitations on the equipment back then that meant it wasn't easy to achieve. So that's one of the examples of, you just don't know what is going to come out of the woodwork. And obviously that was led by one particular manufacturer that kind of really was starting to be successful with it. But that then spawned a whole lot of variable data handling middleware apps that were able to do the form layouts in between. So it would come from the back end, hit the middleware, and then it would get to the machine as a complete print job. Created a whole new thing. And that's what, going back to your original question about other changes in that time in the industry, over time they started going, okay, we're not getting as much revenue from this part of the thing, so we need to go more into services. So that's where I spent a huge chunk of my career, was consulting on ways of taking data and turning it into print, or print hard copy stuff and turning it back into data. They're the two areas. So in the industry, it's typically output management, which is print, and input management, which is any kind of data ingestion. So yeah, and those things have both played off each other a lot. But I think in recent years, we've seen how massively scan volumes have increased, and of course you needed MFDs to be able to do that. We used to sometimes see some customers used to have what they called scanning bureaus, where they might have these desktop scanners that would just sit in one part of the building, and if you wanted big scan jobs done, you'd take them to them. But MFDs just brought scan to the masses, because anyone can just walk up and scan to it. And then you add PaperCut, and it's it goes straight to them. They don't have to fluff around with some technology on the machine. So yeah, a lot. It's that constant change which has kept me interested as well. And for me, it's also learning what customers do. Like, I just loved spending time in customer environments, learning their business.
That's a great segue that you're still excited and still enthusiastic about it, because I really want to know, for most people, looking for jobs, looking for an industry change or a career change, they'd look at print and go, come on, man, it's a bit lame. But the way you're describing it, it's vital, it's dynamic. Is it a career to get involved in?
I mean, I don't think you have to necessarily even frame it as a limitation, because everything any software company does, we do.
Yeah.
And the skills that you learn, whether it's in the print industry or any other industry, if you're doing software development or software design or architecture or any of the myriad of things that are connected with it, it's not really I still don't see it. This is back to our original conversation. I still don't see it as the print industry. I see it as the software industry. In which case, yes, I think there's a lot. and we will do the same. And we know that this is happening. You know, that there are pressures that we are noticing and that we're adapting to. And we have strategies for, you know, we know that print volumes are declining.
Yeah.
But as Willem said, although print volumes are declining, revenues are not declining. You know, there's different ways of making these things relevant, and print still has. I mean, as Willem said, I've been in the industry also for 30 years, and I've been hearing since the beginning, print is dying. Right? Yeah. I've seen people have their whole careers now. Since I was told print was dying, so it will. But we like paper. We really do like reading on paper. It's a different experience reading on paper. I think things are more permanent when you read it on paper. But of course you don't want to be reading everything on paper. And technology then putting realistic constraints on the use of technology is important. For example, I remember a customer many, many years ago. I'm not going to name any solutions or any customers or even cities, but I was spending some time within this customer. We'd implemented a print management solution, and it became very rapidly apparent that there was a department who had been producing 2 4,000-page, roughly, reports, and rounding, per week, right? These reports were coming, it turned out, because we saw this in the data all of a sudden, because they'd never been capturing any information about what was happening, and they were just relying on the amount of consumables they were going through to be indicative of their costs. And so this then suddenly showed up, that we had this weekly 4,000-ish pages thing occurring in this one department, but no one was aware of it. And it's like, well, how do all of those reams of paper disappear? Like, what's going on? It turned out, once some questions were asked, that a cleaner was very diligently just cleaning up the print room at the end of the day and taking those whole jobs every week and putting them straight in the recycling. So, like...
And the cycle continues.
The cycle continues. So you know, you don't want everything printed, obviously. And you've got to be aware of what you're printing. It's really important, otherwise you're just throwing money away.
Yeah. I should have asked this before, but one of the things that people don't always connect is that a printer, an MFD, is both computer and, well, it's electromechanical.
Yes.
For want of a better term. So it's a whole bunch of hardware and it's a whole bunch of software. How have they changed in your career? Because I'd contend that you could get a photocopier from the 50s or from the 60s and line it up next to, you know, a modern one. You'd be hard pressed to see huge design differences. They're still a big square box. They still have pull-out drawers and stuff. Sure,
yeah. Externally, in terms of the things that the human interacts with, I would agree with you. Internally, they're chalk and cheese. Internally, they're chalk and cheese from. I mean, there weren't any in the 50s because that was lithograph sort of. But once photocopiers, as we know it, became prevalent, which is kind of in the 80s, then and that's when they can't. Yeah, I won't go there. Anyway, so yeah, since then, the internals of the things have gone through multiple. There's probably about 5 generations I'm kind of grouping in my head right now of significant steps that changed everything. Now what it's about is rapid service. So back in even the early 2000s when you would call, you know, because you had a photocopy that wasn't working, a technician would come and those technicians would actually diagnose individual chip problems on boards and replace them and solder them on and do all that sort of stuff. They'd rewire looms, they'd do all sorts of stuff. Nowadays, things just come as assemblies in boxes. They just pull them out, and they replace them, and they're gone because of labour costs. Yeah. So, you know, it's one of those things that these are now actually almost like an IKEA assemblage.
Yeah.
of just all of these parts that are all available as spare parts, well, except for the chassis and stuff like that. But yeah.
Where does the reason I asked you that is because I'm really interested in where the future of the industry is going.
Yeah.
Do you want to take a stab?
I don't think I've ever been right about that.
Just say something wrong, and then maybe we'll have a better chance at it being right.
I know the industry trends are indicating a significant uptick in the use of AI in user-facing machines like MFDs as well. And so I'm aware of that, but as someone who uses AI for a lot of things, I'm struggling to figure out what value that would really bring, because these devices are very low powered. If there's something in the cloud behind it, different story.
Sure.
But if it's just on the devices themselves, they are computers, but they're very low powered devices.
Yeah.
So I can't really conceptualize what they're going to potentially do with AI on the devices unless it relates to the user experience. I could see that happening. That would be quite a cool thing. Imagine you walk up, you badge on, the screens you see are completely different to the ones other people because it gets to know what you regularly do. I could see that happening. That's not really AI, that's just machine learning. Anyway, so beyond that, I think it's all going to be services. And I think the services, again, the ways that multifunctional devices interface with business process and organizational process is extraordinary, because there's always information flowing in and out. So there's information coming out as print because it needs to interface with something that can't talk digitally. And then same, when this stuff comes in, often from outside the organization, you need to be able to ingest it and do things with it. And in terms of needing people to make decisions on those things, those days are well and truly gone, but they can be absolutely enhanced by machine learning to figure out what the humans typically do. So I can see that being a real focus of it. But like when you think about the decline in prints and as so many more business processes have become digital, out there in the real world, there is so much paper sitting in businesses, taking up real estate, whether it's in archives, compactuses, warehouses, all of these things, records that are from the pre-digital workflow era. They still need to do something with that data. So I see that as, we're in the golden era of that right now, as far as I'm concerned. It's about all of this opportunity to help organizations deal with all that paper-based information, which actually has value, but it has no value when it's locked in paper. It has value once you convert it to data that you can run analytics over, and you can see what trends were. Last time there was a drought of this magnitude in 1972, because you actually have the data right there, but you can't access it.
That's fascinating. What are a couple of your predictions that have fallen flat, just so I understand?
That print would be over about 30 years ago.
Yeah, you touched on AI, and I know working really closely next to you, I see you and I hear you working with AI. How's that changed the way you work?
I feel like it was the perfectly timed thing for me personally, and I'm not saying everything's about me, but I think somehow I manifested AI in just in the way that I have spent most of my career figuring out ways to explain technically complex things in plain language. That makes you really good at prompts on AI, and so to be able to explain what I want and have these tools so rapidly give me what I want. A lot of the stuff that I do relates to, there's some small, I'm so sick of doing this repetitive task. There has got to be a way to do this better. So, to have a conversation with an AI saying, this is my problem, this is what I want to achieve. I know these things, I've got these technologies at my fingertips. What can you suggest? And for AI to come back and go, all right, well, there's an API for that, and there's a thing for that, and if we do it via this process, we can do, and then within, less than a day, I can have solved something that starts paying dividends straight away because it's some process that I do all the time. That's awesome. But for me here, it's really mainly research. Like, I'm not going to name any particular tools because by the time people watch this video, they could have all changed anyway. But the amount of research I have to do particularly with our competitive comparison stuff, because there's legal risk in getting those things wrong. AI has taken me from many weeks of effort for each competitor to update this stuff to about an afternoon. And that's happened since last year. Like, I used AI last year and it helped me enormously, but how much that has changed in that time, I'm just amazed at how quickly I can reliably get what I want that's all sourced and credited and checked, and I can fact check it, and it's a matter of knowing, you're still going to know what you need and what your outcome is that you want, and you have to really know how you would do it. That's the downside, I think, of AI. You know, I worry about people coming into careers now supported by these tools, and how are they going to be able to be creative about new ways to solve problems if they're reliant.
Yeah, without the life experience or
Right.
the work experience. Yeah. Luca, it's been a beautiful catch up. Thanks for joining me on the sofa.
My pleasure.
And can't wait to see who our next guest is. You're a legend.